I now turn it over to Tom Jipping, Senior Legal Fellow in Heritage's Center for Legal and Judicial Studies. We hope you enjoy the program.
Thanks. I'm joined today by Ed Whalen, who holds the Antonin Scalia Chair in Constitutional Studies at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. He also served in the judicial and the legislative branch, and as a commentator and scholar, has followed judicial appointments and the Supreme Court for a long time. Welcome, Ed.
Thank you, Tom.
You know, a lot of people today may be hearing the phrase court packing for the first time, but it's been around for a long time, and there wasn't any confusion, at least in the beginning, back in 1936, 37, when the debate over President Franklin Roosevelt's court packing plan was underway as to what it is. But since the idea is back, we need to clarify what it is and what it isn't. How would you define court packing?
Well, I would say court packing is adding seats to a court in order to alter the ideological composition of the court. It's designed to attack judicial independence by saying, look, we have a court that seems to be composed a certain way. We want different results. We're going to add seats, not for any reason involving casework or anything, but because we want to alter the ideological composition of the court. That, of course, is what FDR tried to do back in 1937, even as he pretended he was doing something else. Everyone recognized what was going on. And this became the classic textbook case of an illegitimate attack on the rule of law and an attack on a proper understanding of judicial independence. And
you know, the Congress rejected FDR's plan. The Senate voted 70-20 to reject it, and in a Senate that was overwhelmingly Democratic, and they did so not because necessarily Roosevelt simply wanted to add members to the court, but the reason he wanted to add them was what really triggered the opposition, wasn't it?
Exactly. Roosevelt pretended that he was concerned about those poor aging justices who wouldn't be able to handle their workload. So the guise was that you'd anytime a justice would reach the age of 70, you'd add another seat to help that justice carry out the workload, which of course doesn't reflect an understanding of how the court actually works. But everyone, including his political allies, knew that what he really wanted to do was create a court that would rubber stamp his New Deal projects, and that was what this was all about. Not the reasons he presented publicly. And of course, he had run for re-election in 1936 without saying a word about this. He had not tried to obtain any democratic legitimacy or ratification for this concept. As you indicated, a Senate that was overwhelmingly Democratic repudiated his enterprise, and this has since been understood as just off the table when it comes to dealing with the Supreme Court.
So court packing is adding positions to the Supreme Court or another court for the purpose of changing its decisions, not for the purpose of equipping that court to better handle its caseload, because sometimes Congress does that for the lower courts and hasn't done that in a while, but sometimes they will do that. Interesting historical note, the Congress back then knew the difference between, because as we've said, the Senate rejected court packing, but then over the next 4 years, Franklin Roosevelt replaced 8 justices on the Supreme Court, and the Senate confirmed them with a total of 20 negative votes among all 8 of them. In fact, 6 of them didn't even have a roll call vote. So the Senate knew the difference between filling vacancies as they happen versus adding positions to change the direction of the court. Today, advocates for court packing, they'll make the observation that Congress does have the authority to change the number of judges on a particular court. They just make that observation as if, therefore, Congress can and should do that now. There isn't any question about that. Congress does have the authority, doesn't it?
I think that's correct. Again, there are things that can be formally permissible and still be deeply contrary to core separations of powers values. And the lesson from 1937 is that court packing contravenes those important values.
In January, former Attorney General Eric Holder, he'd done it before, but he renewed his support for court packing. And he then, and also when Senator Ed Markey and Congressman Jerry Nadler introduced legislation to add 4 seats to the Supreme Court, they said that one of the reasons the court needed to be expanded was that the number of justices on the Supreme Court should equal the number of circuits on the U.S. Court of Appeals. It had been that way in the 19th century. It ought to be that way again. How would you respond to that?
Well, back in the 19th century, when indeed seats were occasionally added because of the circuit riding responsibility, the justices rode circuit. That is, it was their responsibility to go out and travel and try cases and decide them out in Wisconsin or Missouri, and that was time-consuming work. But that circuit riding responsibility was Congress abandoned that in the 19th century, and instead instituted the system of appellate courts that we have today. And the idea that because we have a federal circuit, say, that sits in DC and that handles intellectual property cases, that we somehow need a justice to ride circuit for the federal circuit or the DC circuit, I mean, this is ludicrous. This is, you know, as you know, patently dishonest as FDR's claim that he was really trying to help those old justices.
Yeah, when members of Congress hear, or their staff hear, or we read about that kind of an argument, it is a little bit discouraging that, you know, here you have a former attorney general, you have the current chairman of the House Judiciary Committee talking about our judicial system as if it was the 19th century. I mean, there hasn't been any necessary connection between the number of justices and the number of circuits for more than 100 years.
But more dispiriting, I think, is the effort to snooker the American public. You know, Eric Holder and Gerald Nadler know that what they're giving as their supposed reasons are not their motivations. They know that court packing is deeply unpopular. They know that Joe Biden did not run on court packing, indeed tried to distance himself from it in the 2020 election, and almost surely would have lost if he embraced it. They know that the Senate would be very unlikely to be in Democratic hands if senators had openly embraced court packing. So this is you know, a shell game that ought to be condemned. You know, let's if they want to make the argument straight up for court packing, go ahead and do it, but don't pretend you're doing something else.
Let's talk about, I mean, some advocates for court packing are very straightforward as to why they want to expand the courts. Left-wing groups are advocating it quite strongly. If you look at the material that they put out on their website and the arguments that they make, they say a couple of things. First, they say there's a 6-3 supermajority on the Supreme Court, 6 Republican appointees, 3 Democratic appointees, and that somehow by itself means that some balancing needs to be done, and that's why we ought to add justices. What would you say to that?
Well, this balance argument that the left makes always seems to cut in one direction. I know that when President Clinton nominated Ruth Bader Ginsburg to replace Byron White, you didn't hear complaints that this would be altering the ideological balance of the Supreme Court. Look, we are where we are for a variety of reasons, including important victories in the political arena. The victory by Donald Trump in 2016 over Hillary Clinton, a victory that obviously surprised and threw into despair many on the left. The fight over the Scalia vacancy, that was a central part of that presidential campaign, and this seat that President Trump was unable to fill, along, of course, with the seats vacated by Anthony Kennedy and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So where we are where we are through the ordinary operation of the political processes, and the idea that this requires some sort of exceptional response, I think, is fed more by grievance, by an ill-founded sense of grievance than by any proper understanding of American politics.
I'm looking here at a column or an op-ed that was in the New York Times in 2019. It says, if you're mad about Kavanaugh and Gorsuch, pack the court. And then a year later, I've got here an article from The Atlantic that said, if you're mad about the appointment of Amy Coney Barrett, pack the court. I mean, that doesn't even seem to be a sensible response. I mean, if your response is supposed to have some relationship with the problem, changing the structure of the court itself going forward is hardly a response to the appointment of a particular justice that you don't like.
Right. Now, the left is happy to destroy the Supreme Court in the process of trying to steal it. I think that's a deeply dangerous effort. We can look at the particulars of these things that they complain about. Let's take the Scalia vacancy that Mitch McConnell held open during 2016. Mitch McConnell is following the playbook that Joe Biden prescribed way back in 1992 about what Biden would do if a vacancy developed in the last year of George H.W. Bush's administration. The same playbook that Harry Reid and Chuck Schumer set forth in 2007 and 2008 regarding a vacancy that would arise in the last year of George W. Bush's administration. The very thing that Barack Obama's former White House counsel, Catherine Rumler, candidly acknowledged she would have recommended if the political polarities were reversed. This was something that had been long baked into the process. Obviously, inaction on nominees has been a Senate prerogative as far back as you can go. There's nothing at all exceptional about this. Republicans made a big bet. They won. And indeed, let's have in mind that during 2016, the left ran away from Merrick Garland. His name was not mentioned one time at the Democratic convention. They were pushing Hillary Clinton upon her, all but certain victory to nominate someone else. So the idea that they're then hiding behind him as a martyr is just a revisionist account of history that we should not allow to stand.
Well, yeah, go ahead.
So then we come, forward to last year. It was a Democrats' abolition of the filibuster that paved the way for Amy Coney Barrett to be confirmed at the very end of President Trump's presidency. They did this back in 2013 with respect to lower court nominees, Democrats did. And then weeks before the 2016 election, Harry Reid proclaimed that at the very first opportunity, Democrats would do the remaining bit to abolish the Supreme Court filibuster, a provision that had been left in place, as it happens, only in deference to Planned Parenthood and NARAL, who were concerned that if that filibuster weren't there, a pro-life president with a Republican Senate would be able to get an anti-Roe candidate confirmed. So look, they have made short-term political calculations all along. They have lost the bets they've made. That's the situation. That explains the situation we're in, and it seems like they're ready to make another very short-term bad bet. Because let's have in mind that if somehow they were to increase the court to 13 members, soon it'll be 17 and 19 and 23 and 39 and 117. Again, you're destroying any sense of what a court is for nakedly ideological reasons.
Another historical note, while advocates of court packing today say we ought to expand the court because it's a 6-3 Republican majority, in March of 1937, when FDR's court packing plan was introduced, the ratio was 7-2. There were 7 Republican appointees, 2 Democrat, and one of the Democrat appointees were one of the so-called 4 horsemen who were voting to strike down FDR's New Deal legislation. So effectively, it was an 8-1 court, and Democrats still said judicial independence is more important than politically manipulating the court. I want to talk a little bit about even if let's put aside the fact that all of these problems with court packing, the destruction of judicial independence and all that. But would it work? I mean, a lot of times when I hear this discussion about court packing today and read about it and so on, people talk about kind of the merits of it, but as a practical matter, can you get the decisions you want simply by appointing a few judges? You clerked on the Supreme Court. You've studied it and followed it for a long, long time. I went back. I mentioned the four horsemen. The four justices who most consistently voted against FDR's New Deal legislation included a Republican appointee. The three musketeers, the three justices who most consistently supported, I'm sorry, a Democrat appointee, and the three musketeers who most consistently supported FDR's New Deal legislation included a Republican appointee. Since then, I mean, they say, as President Eisenhower said, his two biggest mistakes were on the Supreme Court, Earl Warren and William Brennan. Roe versus Wade, a Republican appointee, Justice Blackmun, wrote the opinion. Republican appointees, Chief Justice Berger, Justice Brennan, Justice Stewart, Justice Powell, they were all in the majority. More recently, the Obergefell decision about gay marriage, written by Anthony Kennedy. It was a 5-4 decision. NFIB versus Sebelius upholding Obamacare, 5-4 decision. Chief Justice Roberts was in the majority. I mean, the idea that a president can choose robots, I guess, can choose appointees who they know will, vote a certain way and address certain issues in a certain way and predict the cases that are going to come before the court in the future so that they get what they want. I think that's absurd. What do you think?
Well, I guess I'd add to your examples of Byron White, the Kennedy appointee, who was one of the dissenters in Roe and generally an opponent of substantive due process. That said, Tom, I'm more skeptical than you are. I think we've had the parties very much sort around judicial ideology. I think there's this deep divide now. I think there's a real corruption of constitutional thinking on the left, where constitutional theorizing is really nothing more than coming up with excuses to impose the political results that you want. So I think it'd be fairly easy if Joe Biden had carte blanche for him to put on the bench folks who, at least over the next 10, 15 years, would be very predictable, reliable votes for liberal causes. Now, over the longer term, who knows what the fights of 20 years from now will be about. But yeah, I wouldn't want to take the gamble that they wouldn't get what they wanted through this stratagem.
The title of our discussion today has two parts. One is a bad idea, and we've been talking about how, like 1937, the idea of expanding the court in order to appoint justices who will deliver the goods, so to speak, is a terrible idea and would destroy the independence of the courts. But the second part of our discussion is it's a worse idea now, and that has to do with what would it take to institute court packing? What would it take to establish that in law? As we said, in 1937, Democrats had a huge majority. They could have passed it if they stuck together. They chose not to. Today, you have a 50-50 Senate. Let's say the House passes court packing legislation to add those 4 justices, and then that bill comes over. What would it take to get it passed in the Senate?
Well, for starters, assuming that Republicans stood strong against the measure, as I think it's safe to say they would, you would need to have the Democrats abolish the legislative filibuster. A huge move that would then, pave the way for the left to achieve all sorts of other dramatic transformational change via a 50-50 Senate. So that would be, I think, revolutionary in terms of how the Senate operates. And I would hope that there would be Democratic senators like Joe Manchin, perhaps like Kirsten Sinema, who would stand against that. But it would be quite extraordinary and, again, pave the way for all sorts of other things.
And I think even when he was a senator, Joe Biden himself voted against eliminating the legislative filibuster. That's been, and you worked in the Senate as I did, that's been the single most distinctive feature of the Senate as a legislative body for more than 200 years. So you'd have, in an effort to get decisions in a few cases, the left would want to change the entire Supreme Court. And in order to get a few bills passed, the left would want to change the entire Senate. I mean, it would be two branches instead of one that would undergo this kind of revolution. Last year, well, as I mentioned, Joe Biden has a record on these things. He was a senator for 36 years. Back in 1983, he called court packing a terrible, terrible mistake and a boneheaded idea. Even during the presidential campaign, he said, if we pack the court, it's going to come back and eat us alive, he said. During the October 2019 Democratic debate, he said, I would not get into court packing. We add 3 justices. Next time around, we lose control. They add 3 justices. We begin to lose any credibility the court has at all. That's the point that you were just making a minute ago. But then last fall, October, he's been pushed to endorse it. He gives this interview on 60 Minutes where he says, well, I'm going to instead create a commission that's going to look at court reform ideas. Now, in that interview, he said that commission was not going to look at court packing. It looks like they are. But what impact do you think this commission will have in terms of the debate and perhaps the reality of either court packing or other court reform ideas?
Well, I'm inclined to view a presidential commission as often a pathway to the graveyard for an idea. And I think that may be what Joe Biden intends. He's nominated or appointed some 3 dozen individuals to this commission, mostly left-leaning, but some strong conservatives as well. I think it's going to be very difficult for this group to reach consensus on any proposal, much less on court packing. So maybe I'm giving President Biden too much credit, but I had thought that he was deftly deflecting court packing back in the campaign by announcing this commission. And I see nothing in his executive order that makes me think otherwise. That said, how strong will he be in standing up to the left? He hasn't been so far on so many things. So, we'll have to see. If push comes to shove, is he going to maintain the positions that he's spelled out and been elected on over the years?
Do you think these left-wing groups that are pushing court packing, and some even say court packing is more important than other possible reforms? They have this narrative that, and they use phrases like the court is broken or the courts are in crisis. Biden in his 60 Minutes interview was a little bit more casual when he said the Supreme Court is out of whack. He didn't really explain what that meant, but but it's this idea that there's this unbalanced court there. It's in crisis. It's been hijacked. It's been stolen. This idea. Even if this commission doesn't come out with, let's say, a specific endorsement for a particular reform, could it still contribute to this sort of narrative that there's, because there's a commission and it's examining the court and there's these reform ideas, and of course, if you're going to have reform, that means something's got to be wrong, that it could contribute to this overall sort of narrative that the courts are a problem, that the courts need to be changed in some way, which I think, would be a real negative development because people are perceiving the courts as too political anyway. What do you think?
Yeah, well, it's interesting that both the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Stephen Breyer have made clear their opposition to court packing. I think they have a much better understanding of how the court is working than a lot of these groups on the left. That said, there's some risk that these radical ideas could get normalized simply by being talked about. and become more palatable as a result. I am hopeful that when the commission does issue its report, that may well be way down the road, that the effect will be to treat this concept as objectionable, as a non-starter. We'll see if it even addresses it, but if it does, I doubt that there'll be more than a handful of members who embrace it.
There, back in 1937, when FDR's plan was in the Congress, it clearly was rejected in terms of an actual plan, a specific piece of legislation. Some scholars, historians, they look back and then they see that perhaps it had some kind of an impact in terms of intimidating the court or pushing the court to maybe change how it did things. Sort of a shot across the bow, perhaps, that if you don't move in that direction, we might try to change you in some way. 2000, I think it was 2019, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island, along with several of his Democratic colleagues, filed an amicus brief in a Supreme Court gun control case. And that brief, I think I have it here, yeah. The last words of the brief are, "The Supreme Court is not well, and the people know it. Perhaps the court can heal itself before the public demands that it be restructured in order to reduce the influence of politics." And a lot of people saw that as the same kind of message, like, get your act together, change your ways, or we're going to change you. Are you concerned at all that the commission could contribute to that sort of dynamic where, again, even if it doesn't endorse specific ideas, the politicians or the president is using this commission to sort of send this message, and that it could have some kind of subtle impact?
Yes, and back in 1937, it was Justice Owen Roberts who was said to have done the so-called switch in time that saved 9. Now, I think historians looking at court papers have more recently dismissed that theory. They've said that he had his position, I believe in the case of West Coast Hotel versus Parrish, established before FDR started talking about this. But now it's clear that another Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts, is the target of intimidation efforts by the left. And he unfortunately has given them reason to think, it's not crystal clear, but reason to think that their efforts at intimidation are working. So whether it's this commission or the campaign for court packing generally, or the sort of amicus briefs with over-the-top language by the likes of Sheldon Whitehouse, I think you are going to see this continuing effort by the left to intimidate the court into not doing its duty, to try to persuade the Chief Justice and others that judicial statesmanship would somehow consist of bowing to this political pressure. And I think it would be a grave folly if the justices were to give into that.
And people may remember Senator Schumer, who's now the majority leader of the Senate, stood on the steps of the Supreme Court when they were hearing arguments in an abortion case. He spoke by name. He said, Justices Kavanaugh and Gorsuch, you will reap the whirlwind, or whatever that means, kind of.
You won't know what hit you.
Yeah, you won't know what hit you. I mean, it was a direct threat.
Comment.
I mean, those, it seems to me, are in the same category as court packing.
Absolutely, and that comment, which received certainly some criticism at the time, I think should have been universally condemned, and yet this is now our Senate Majority Leader.
And just one last question. Back in 1937, the biggest opponent of the court packing scheme was the American Bar Association. They did nationwide surveys and presented all kinds of research to the Senate Judiciary Committee, and practically had a whole day of hearing by itself to present the case. As far as I can tell, they're silent on that today. Why do you think that is?
Well, silence is better than support for the proposal. My guess is that there's an internal divide, and that the path of least resistance is to say that we don't need to deal with this right now, which may have some merit to it. Look, right now, while the proposal has gotten a lot of attention, the lead sponsor in the Senate is Ed Markey. I mean, that doesn't really seem like a great lead sponsor for something you intend to get through. In the House, I believe that Nancy Pelosi has already indicated that she's not really interested in moving this. Now, that might change. I don't mean to be complacent about this, but it's not clear at this point that the proposal is going to go anywhere.
One of the things that contributed to the failure of court packing in 1937. The American people were about evenly split at the beginning, but trended increasingly negative as it got debated and discussed. The several polls I've seen over the last 6 months or so show that by almost 2 to 1, the American people are against this idea. It's probably true they don't understand all of the ins and outs of it unless they see this podcast or listen to this podcast. But is that an encouraging sign that the American people at least have a sense that, you ought to keep your hands off the Supreme Court, let it do its job?
Oh, it is. And I think the evasive and dishonest reasons that Eric Holder and Gerald Nadler have given for this proposal show that they know they can't win a candid debate over court packing. Look, I'd love to have Senate Democrats go into the 2022 election making this their centerpiece. Joe Biden is president in part because he had the sense not to do that last year, and the Democrats control the Senate in part because he had the sense not to do so.
Well, I think you'd agree the idea of judicial independence, which actually is one of the items listed in the Declaration of Independence as to why we are a separate country, is critical. Justice Scalia spoke of that often, and that's at the heart of this debate. It's not whether you're pro-abortion or anti-gun or something like that. It's whether you believe that the judiciary should be independent and impartial. Hopefully that principle will win out. And the more, I think just like in 37, the more this can be debated and discussed and the basics of it can be brought to the American people, I think people, whether they've been to law school or not, frankly, on some of these things, if you go to law school, that's where your mind gets messed up about some of this. But just common sense and a basic sense of what how judges ought to be impartial and independent. I think most people have that just in their common sense, and I think they'll understand that this is a bad idea. Ed, I want to thank you for joining the discussion. We'll be making various resources, things that you and I have written and others available to people as a follow-up. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Hopefully this is a useful discussion and it'll help people understand the debate and participate in it better. Thanks a lot, Ed.
Thank you, Tom. Enjoyed it.